since we are the German Primate Center, it would be meaningful to talk about animal research in particular monkeys. And you already said several times, why it's important to address these questions in monkeys. But what do you do at this scientific center to address the well-being of the animals and to diminish, so to say, their suffering?
Yeah, so that's a very important question, and this is also something that from day one when I entered that field many years ago, it was for me clear that I personally need to be comfortable with the way we're doing the research. Otherwise, I would not do it. And that requires a very high level of responsibility. That's what I expect from all the members of my team. That's what I expect from myself. And as you said, or as I try to explain with my examples, I don't think that invasive research with animals anytime soon we can give up on if we want to understand the brain. I think it will be around for quite some while. And also these highly developed animals like macaque monkeys, rhesus macaques, or marmoset monkeys will remain important models, maybe even more important than they used to be now that we realize more and more the differences between rodents, and that translation to humans is often difficult unless you have also the primate model in between. So having said all that, I think we have one big advantage here at the German Primate Center, and that is that we're not only keeping these animals in small numbers for the immediate research need, but we are also a breeding facility, so we have very many of those animals, and we're having them since 40 years. So in that sense, what we have managed to achieve here is, and when I say we, I mean, of course, the people who have been there all the time and in other departments also, not just in our group, is a huge level of expertise. And that is just starting from the caretakers, via the vets, via the technicians, and the scientists. The scientists are the ones that are fluctuating actually at the highest frequency, right? The PhD students come and go, postdocs come and go. But what we try to create maximal stability, and I think that's one important measure, is with all the rest of the personnel. So the animal trainers, we have hired trainers who help with all these initial steps of getting animals integrated into our groups. We do group housing, right? Our animals live together with 2, 3, 4 other animals. The enclosures are much larger than that the EU legislation would require us to have. They have a heated indoor compartment, which is already bigger than needed, but then they also have the opportunity to go something that is semi-outside, so it's still protected from weather, but it has outside temperatures. And through all levels of interacting with the animals, we make sure that the people who are interacting with them don't change too often, so that they get used, they can build some level of trust, so to speak. They know what to expect. So you need to do this all in very small steps. That's also important. Don't confront an animal from one day to the next with a complete new situation. It will cause stress. There's no doubt about it. So we use what's called positive reinforcement training, so basically reward-based learning, to introduce them to new tasks. And at no point we will use any physical force or anything like that. So the animal, by means of understanding that if I do this, I get a certain type of reward. If I do that, I get a different type of reward. They learn to come from the large enclosure into a smaller enclosure. That smaller enclosure, we can push a little plexiglass in front of it. We call it the primate chair. The animals learn to climb into that chair and receive their reward. The animals learn that they stick out their head and let them be touched at the head, or later it will be then the implants. That's why we do this training early on, by means of being rewarded for it. And so you go step by step, always with familiar settings, with familiar people, so that they don't get too nervous about these steps. That's extremely important. And then once the animals are in the experiment, of course, you have multiple levels of assessing the current state of the animal. That starts with the caretakers who see them every day. It's the vets that basically see them almost every day. It's the scientists who learn in bi-weekly discussions where we go through each and every animal and discuss the status of this animal, what to pay attention to. We do a lot of measurements on their weight development, on their consumption of fluids, on their fur condition, on their blood values. So it's a database with, by now, I think, millions of entries. We can, with one click, visualize their weight development over the last 30 days or the last 5 years, and you can see if something suspicious happening there. So it is this approach. Collect a lot of data, get to know your animal as well as you can, have the same people working with those animals over many years so that you notice when the behavior change. We have behavioral biologists who do also behavioral studies with them. And that's something that I wanted to add as a last point. We think we need to urgently move away when it comes to animal welfare questions from a highly anthropomorphic view that is quite common, right? People look at animals and think they have an understanding of what the animal experiences. And I think that's a very risky thing. Yes, with your own pet that you've been living together with for many years, I think you have a good feeling of whether something has changed and whether it's not feeling well. We try to get to this point with our monkeys as well. But of course, you also have sometimes new animals in the facility and you don't know them that well yet. So we still also need to be able to assess their welfare as well as with the others. And there, I think anthropomorphic view doesn't help us too much, and we need to approach this problem of assessing animal welfare with the same scientific rigor that we address all other research questions. And that's why our scientific director, Stefan Treu, and we are part of a consortium among other researchers in Germany who have really research projects on assessing animal welfare. And one of the things that we did there, for example, was that we took hormone samples, saliva samples, where we measured stress hormones in the context of an animal being in the experiment or not being in the experiment, and compared those. Turned out the fluctuations introduced by being in the experiment or not were completely negligible to the change in those hormones that you see over the course of the day between morning hours and late hours. So this was really minimal effects, basically no effects of the treatment. It told us, okay, apparently these animals were already super well accustomed to the situation, and that's why they didn't bother much about sitting in a chair or not. Other measures we took is, for example, cognitive testing. There is these famous, even in lay terms, we say, do you see the glass half full or half empty? It's called cognitive bias, and there is tests where you can test the cognitive bias, and we develop versions of that for animals. Also, attentional bias is sometimes used as a stress indicator. So we've developed machines that we can hang to the enclosures of the animals, touchscreen-based systems, kiosk systems, and the animals can go there anytime and work with this, and we can run those cognitive bias tests, for example. And we hope that by this we can have a warning system in future that if something shifts for an animal that we can look closer at it. And the last step that we did is to overcome, hopefully at some point, this anthropomorphic bias. Is we said, okay, what matters in the end is not how we think is less burden for the animal, but what the animal thinks. So we're currently developed a subjective severity scale that measures basically how much you would have to pay in terms of reward to an animal to opt for this version of the task versus this version. And these versions could be, for example, can I stay seated in my home enclosure and do the task on the touchscreen there? We would call it now mobile working. Or do I go into the lab as I used to go, with the transport being involved, with sitting in a room where I'm not anywhere close to my peers, right? I cannot see them, I cannot smell them, I cannot hear them. I'm in a separate room. What would the animals pick if they had the choice? Turned out there was a a much more demanding project to get meaningful data than we hoped for, as often in research, for the reasons that apparently the differences for these animals for going to the lab or working with these machines in the local environment seems to be not very big. At least there was a lot of other factors that dominated actually their choice much more than this distinction. But by now we've recorded a few animals, and we think we have a way of titrating what preference would an animal have for which type of experimental setting. But we're talking the complexity of typical research projects, right? A PhD student being involved for 2-3 years before you get really conclusive data. But I think we need this level of rigor to make decisions about what are actually really the better procedures and what are not the better procedures. Because if we just go by intuition, we might sometimes not have the animal in the focus, but our view, and that might not be the correct one.
Neuroscience and Beyond. Know more, get inspired.